Thank you. So this session today will be held in English because our guest of honor, Karl-Stéphan Bouthillette, is of Canadian descent. I know Karl speaks German as well, but I think you're more comfortable with English. And therefore, our session will be in English as usual. I will introduce you. You will have time then to hold your presentation, and eventually we will engage in a dialogue. In the beginning of 2025, I had the pleasure to work together with Karl on a conference in India, in Manipal. It was a conference about philosophy as therapy. That's how I actually got to know Karl better. And when I was in India, I was very surprised how big philosophy as therapy, but especially also philosophical counseling is in India. And not only in India, but also in the universities where they teach philosophical counseling. And this is not so much the case in German-speaking countries, at least according to my experience. So I was really surprised, and I thought we have to invite someone from India to share his or her experiences. And therefore, Karl joins us today. I'm very pleased and happy that you are joining us, Karl. It's rather not a surprise, but you became a father on Monday, so congratulations again. So you have all the rights to be sitting at home and to be with your family, but I think your love for philosophy is maybe almost as big as the love for your newborn son, but it's pretty big. That's the reason why you're here, although it's 11 o'clock in the night in India, where you're sitting at the moment. And let me start with a very brief introduction of your biography, because I think it's very impressive and we have many things in common besides being young fathers. So the first point in your biography is you were born in Canada. And I want to read one of the quotes you sent me from your personal biography, which I found very lovely. You write, "From mosh pits to metaphysics, my life is a blend of defiance, discovery, and deep dives. Sorry. So I think what you have in common with the people here is that you're not only an academic philosopher, but someone who pursues philosophy beyond mere academics. And that's what I find very admirable in your biography. So you were born in Montreal. Your first love was punk music, or mine was hip hop music, and somehow maybe you got an affinity to language and to arts because of that. You were a journalist. Same here. I was a journalist, and then you made your first master's degree in science of religion. You did that in Quebec. Later, a master's in Sanskrit in India at the JNU University. If you ever come to India and you have the chance to visit JNU University, you should do so, because I find it's a very Marxist, leftist campus. You still see paintings of, for example, Mao Zedong on the walls. It's quite impressive and quite lovely. I don't know whether it changed under Modi. Later on, you made your PhD in Indology at the LMU University in Munich, where I saw you, but I think you never saw me. You had postdoctoral research grants at Leiden and Ghent, and eventually you ended up in India, where you know assistant professor. You're building an institute called for philosophy as therapy. Also, that was the reason you inaugurated this conference. But besides this academic career, I think there's a certain personal philosophical / spiritual journey that you underwent. For example, in 2010, you lived in northern India for 3 years. You were in monasteries, once in Nepal, and then in another place as well. One time, I think 3 or 4 months later, 18 months, where you also engaged in Buddhist philosophy, which you later then taught at Chinese Buddhist monasteries. So that was also a part of your spiritual philosophical journey, but outside of academia. Your dissertation was published under the title Dialogue and Doxography. And I was happy to receive just a couple of days ago your new book, at least the digital copy, which is called Metaphysics as Therapy. And I know there's much more to tell about your biography, but let's keep it short at that point. I think we're all eager to hear more about what you have to say. And you're talking today about Gnosticism, about yoga, philosophy, but I think this is the point where you can start off. Thank you very much for joining us, Karl.
Vielen Dank. Freut mich, euch zu sehen. Mein Deutsch ist nicht so gut. Ich habe nicht gesprochen in den letzten 3 Jahren. So if you forgive me, I will continue in English. However, I'm French speaker normally, so it's not that I delight in English particularly, but that's our, I guess, best medium of exchange. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's very an honor, actually. I was looking into the biography of the founder of this group, and to think that he founded on my year of birth, actually, thought it was quite something. And then, so when I received this invitation via Krisha, I was wondering, how to go about it, what to focus on. And there's so many aspects. But you mentioned the fact that there's actually quite an active community now in India around philosophical counseling, philosophical practice. So one could go about talking a little bit about this. I mean, there is a lot of amateur, if you want, endeavors, little attempt here and there within some institution, but we cannot call it, right now, I think, a mature enterprise, and it's not particularly recognized, but there is, at least at Mahe and in some other place, there is a backing from the institution, which is rare. It's perhaps here at Mahe, it's happening because our university is known for its medical sector. Then they like this idea of bridging the medical sector and the humanities, and they see philosophy as therapy as kind of bringing this together. But yeah, I'm not sure if I want to go quite into this at the moment. What I thought is actually a more kind of open, discussion where I'll present you some idea of where I'm intending to go with my work for the next year, perhaps. That will, force me somehow to tell you a bit what I've done so far. Lay the ground a little bit in lay term without being very, technical. So I didn't prepare PowerPoints or something. I just felt like having a human conversation and not slides and academic things. So I hope you bear with me for that. It's also very late here, and I haven't slept very much in the last few days. My baby is just born, but I think there's a lot to be said, and as Krisha mentioned, I am actually quite passionate with the kind of work that I've been dealing recently, and it keeps me awake, and I'm very happy to be able to meet your community and discuss these things. So basically, what I would like to present you some ideas and to hear your feedback on this, so that you can tell me, how it rings, in your ears, because I think some of it will be a bit provocative. I want to highlight an aspect of Indian philosophy that it has somewhat been downplayed by people who have been doing Indian philosophy in the last decades, in my view. It's something that my new book, which actually, funny enough, my last book came out on the same day as my son. So on the 31st of March, my book was published, and I would have planned this, it would have never worked, but somehow life made it so. And so my last book is called, Metaphysics as Therapy, List Making and Renunciation in Gnostic Yogas. And that aspect, which I think is provocative, is this renunciation. It has been quite, it goes against the grain, I would say, of what we often hear today as, modern values of, common life, what in India we call householder life. And there is something quite radical in this renunciation, particularly in the Gnostic currents, which I I've cherished actually. So the book is really dedicated to 4 big schools of Indian philosophy that have really somewhat changed the landscape of philosophizing in India. Uh, and nowadays, when people engage with these schools, most of the time it is in a very rigorous epistemological manner, which makes a lot of sense because these schools have developed intense and heavy and esoteric scholasticism. So it requires a good scholastic training somehow in Sanskrit, but also in logic, and particularly the Indian form of logic and syllogism and argumentation and what we call pramana, the means of knowing and means of verifying and ascertaining truth, certainty of arguments and so forth. So the main focus in, I think, the last few decades has been this kind of epistemology of these schools. And I'm moving back from epistemology to metaphysics, so ontology, perhaps to a certain way. And I'm trying to argue in the book that in that context, in the Gnostic context, metaphysics serves to sustain a very radical project of leaving the world, renunciation. And that, for them, is what they consider the therapy that we need to undergo. So perhaps part of my question, towards the end of this talk, I hope I don't take too much time, and please, you can stop me when we reach those 30 minutes or something. I'm not keeping track. So, but perhaps towards the end, it would be questions of how can we bring this in a meaningful way today without diluting the radicality and the richness and the goal of these traditions. So I hope I could lay the ground a little bit of where I want to go with that. I had proposed a title, Revisiting Philosophical Yoga, the Other-Worldly Gnostic Turn, so Introversion, Asociality, and Arationality. And I chose the asocial and irrational and not antisocial or irrational. Right? So there is this A is a privative some way, and I hope I can make these the choice of these words become meaningful in the course of this talk. But just to I want to give also a kind of a historical perspective of why I think particularly today the renunciation project of those Gnostic is radical. Perhaps I should name them, all right, for those of you who know a little bit about Indian philosophy. The schools that I work with, 2 of them are Hindu. We could say one is called Samkhya. It's perhaps one of the oldest mode of philosophizing in India. Samkhya means numbering. It means list and actually numbers, and it appears in, for centuries in kind of list of different contents. Most of these texts are lost, but we have kept one major, the Samkhya Karika, which has some commentaries on it later on. But the school kind of disappeared. It gave way to what we now call Vedanta. In Vedanta, a school that I chose as properly Gnostic, which is called Advaita, non-dualism. So these are the 2 schools, Hindu schools, that I deal with in my book, Samkhya and Advaita Vedanta. And then one school of Buddhism, Madhyamika Buddhism, so the middle way Buddhism, school of Nagarjuna, profoundly given to the enunciation, study, and contemplation of its particular understanding of the teaching of emptiness, shunya or shunyata. And I also work on a Jain text, which I take from the author is called Kunda, but it's not exactly an author. Like in very common in Indian context, it's most likely a corpora of several people writing under the same name. But this kind of Kunda tradition in Jainism this time, is particularly radical in its shift of perspective within the Jaina worldview. In Jainism, asceticism is predominant, and especially strong physical penance, and mortifications of the body and so forth. And with Kunda, this is not stopped, but priority is given to a form of asceticism which is intellectual. So intellectual asceticism. And I think this label, once intellectual asceticism, covers what I would call Gnostic yoga, right? So same in the Vedanta context, same in the Buddhist context, and in the Jain context. Intellectual asceticism is a practice of contemplation, of philosophical contemplation, particularly, right, on metaphysical topic through a certain application of epistemology in the optic of achieving a higher degree of renunciation, right? So that's somehow something that I try to put forward in my last book. I'm not inventing this, obviously, but perhaps what is original is combining these four traditions together. So covering quite a broad landscape and then reflecting what it means and contemplating different lists of topics, metaphysical systems, and so forth, in the optic of their negation. So something very important also is the negation of these, of all the metaphysic that happens within Gnostic currents. Right, and as I will come back on that a little bit later, negation is what I see as the, if you want, a kind of sacrificial or philosophical sacrifice, which is meant to then sustain a renunciation that is no more only renouncing the world of the senses and wealth and family, but it is a method to renounce the world of projection, of inner representations, the world of views and opinions, the world of ideas, and more or less, if we actually read between the lines, it seems that in the end, the Gnostic project is the total distanciation from one's own culture. And that is where I believe it's really radical, something that we seldom hear today. We're so proud of our culture. Culture is everything, and to hear that some people have this project of actually distanciating themselves from uh, from the world of culture, I don't think it's a particularly popular project today. And particularly now, I want to put this in a historical context. If we go back to post-war Europe, post-war period, it's around the world. New ideas emerge: socialism, democratic ideals, humanism, secularism, social justice, so forth. And these ideas pervade all the fields of scholarship, right? We're talking about, I made a little list of that because I'm preparing an article. That's why I'm asking you to, give me feedback on what you hear and ideas, because I'm planning on working on that. But so post-war period, there is this, if you want, there is a trauma, obviously. I think in Germany, you're aware of this, like no one else. And then that trauma changes the people's perspective on what is religion, and but also on spiritual, so religion, psychology, and philosophy. At least to me, that's where the three fields that I've looked quite recently, because these are three fields which I feel have a strong impact eventually on what we call philosophical practice, or the concept of philosophy as therapy encompasses in a certain way some theories that is derived from either religious or spiritual tradition, from philosophy, obviously, particularly phenomenology, but also from psychology. So, by post-war periods, we have, for example, in Christianity, authors like Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, who promote liberation theology, or Jürgen Moltmann with the theology of hope. In Asia, we have new ideas like humanistic Buddhism or engaged Buddhism with authors like Tai Shi, Xing and Thich Nhat Hanh, which is very popular, very well known these days, who propose a kind of social, engaged form of Buddhism. And we have to put this engaged Buddhism, this humanistic Buddhism in perspective. All right. We have to understand that this puts itself in contrast to something else. And the something else is this idea that this engaged Buddhism will not be like before. Like, so theology, liberation theology seeks to be different than before. And what was before? It was what is somehow called a other-worldly religion, or other-worldly vision of the practice of spiritualities, either awaiting, the kingdom in the afterlife, or renouncing the world today in hope of a better rebirth if we are in the Asian context. So there is this strong discourse that developed post-war that kind of stands against or the traditional idea of renunciation, of abandoning the world, right? And for very, I would say, understandable reason. But this discourse now pervades, I would say, the humanities, right? So in religious studies or in philosophy of religion, these become accepted terms. The either this worldly or otherworldly tradition, and somehow what it tends to do over time is a politicization of these old traditions. So when we have in Asia, we have humanistic Buddhism and engaged Buddhism. In a certain way, what we're having is Marxist Buddhism, right? It's very social Buddhism. These are, if we read some of these texts, we have a more or less a Marxist template, which then is put together with Buddhism. In today's yoga's world, the same ideas continue in yoga studios. Now, I could give you an example. I just want to highlight that ideas of social justice, democracy, and so forth are somehow read together with texts like the Bhagavad Gita, texts like ancient Vedic and sometimes most of the time Brahmanical texts that in themselves have little to do with social justice or democracy or any kind of these politics. So what I'm trying to say again is that post-war periods, there is a kind of shift in worldview in the religious world towards a more social, approach to religion, and trying to reject the old understanding of renunciation. Also, in psychology, we have humanistic psychology with Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, that develops, and it too tries to bring, more, if we want, social practice and understanding of psychology. In philosophy with phenomenology, we see phenomenology also aligns itself with democratic ideals and a rather this-worldly focus on this world, prioritize the human, the embodied perception, and so forth. And I am not in any way criticizing this. I am simply trying to bring this to our awareness that there has been in the last 50 to 60 years a shift, abandoning something of the old religious tradition that sought to promote renunciation. Now, I want to insist just how important actually renunciation is within the tradition that I study, and particularly within India. So in the Indian philosophical context, now that I've moved a little bit away from this post-war period, we go back in philosophical context at all the schools of Indian philosophy, major schools, those we call darshanas. We can, depending how we make the list and the cut, we go from about a dozen different schools. Some are idealist, some are more realist, some are theistic, some are atheistic. But all of them, agree at least on one thing. And that one thing is renunciation. And now, to me, there is kind of a difficulty if we are trying to read these texts and reinterpret them today, trying to see, particularly to read them in an approach that is dear to me, try to see how these texts can be read in a therapeutic manner. If we try to, in our reading of these texts, in our reading of these methods, if we kind of sideline or if we blind ourselves to one of their main goals, which is somehow to call practitioners to abandon the world. And we have to ask ourselves, what is this world that they are talking about, this world that needs to be abandoned? That project, it's not obvious. We all know it's something I write in the book, but we all know how difficult it is for each other to agree on some definition of simple things. It's even more difficult to agree on definition of what is the world, and particularly of a world that needs to be abandoned, right? And this is where somehow the philosophical project of these ancient Indian author becomes quite interesting. They elaborate a certain map of what is the world. In Buddhist context, early on, we have Abhidharma project, which is perhaps one of the earliest systematic manifestation or systematic production through scholasticism of a kind of metaphysical representation of how the world is experimented and experienced. Right? The Dharma somehow reclassified into lists, creating a kind of Buddhist phenomenology, because these dharmas are phenomena that somehow appear to consciousness. And that project is to see, kind of theorize how these appearances function. That's this Buddhist project is mirrored in other schools. With Samkhya, we also have texts that give us a basic kind of ontology, but also at the same time phenomenology of how the world appears, how it manifests itself to an individual. And it's the same in the Jain context. So at the same time, different maps appear to explain what is this world. Now, and we have to understand that this is being produced by a people who are interested in one thing alone, and it's liberation. Some call it nirvana, some call it moksha, some call it kaivalya, nishreyasa. And then there's a series of these names, which in English we go from cessation, liberation, isolation, which is one kaivalya, which I quite like from Samkhya, which will also come to determine the yoga project. We always hear about yoga today as union. Before this idea of yoga as union developed, originally yoga meant disunion. It meant isolation. Yoga project was idea of isolating the individual, but particularly isolating the self from the non-self. Philosophically, that is the foundation for yoga. Before later theorization in theistic environment, which will be centuries later. So I hope you can still follow me a little bit. I know it's a lot of information. I want to give you, I made a selection. I don't know how much time I have, but I made a few text selection just that talk about renunciation, just to give you an idea of how it appears in the literature. So do I have some time, maybe another 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes? Is that okay?
Yeah, another 15 minutes is good. 15.
All right. Then, just please don't hesitate to tell me. I'm really not counting. But so in preparing this talk, I went to a few texts that I know and like, that have that different take on renunciation, and they're from different traditions. The first one I like is one of the latest in the series that I've selected. It's from Tibetan, it's Indo-Tibetan, if you want, author, a tantrika, so it's a practitioner of tantra, who talks about leaving to the woods, right? And he writes. So I would just read a few of these little poems, and you just so that you have a feeling of this, what how it's presented in literature. So he says, having been racked by the virulent plague of worldliness, with the turmoil of its cities full of fiery pits of passionate desires, you ever and again return to it and traverse the narrow defiles of worldliness. Having seen this state of affairs, I go to the wildwood. With the setting of the sun of the noble days of old, and the rising of the moon of evil person in this age, the darkness of Mara's armies. Mara is the god of death, if you want. Scoundrels and villains engulf the directions of the world. Having seen this state of affairs, I now go to the wildwood. Even with persons, it is extremely difficult to find someone on whom to depend. If he be a decent person, he is not attracting anyone. But if he be an evil person, he perpetually attracts others. At the slightest provocation, such people change their moods, and they are not going to be pleased with whatever you may do. I no longer want to go. No, I no longer want to wait. I go into the wildwood, right? So I could continue with him, but I want to move on. I would like to read a few verses that have been written by it's one of the earliest texts that we have of women actually writing in India. So they call it text called Teligata. They were nuns, and we don't have many texts written by women from that period. And the reason I thought it was interesting is because I remember reading somewhere a very feminist approach to renunciation, actually, and it was saying, well, renunciation is something for the men. Renunciation is what men do because men, they have never given birth, and they, unlike us women who actually nurture life, they don't cherish that life. And I would like to problematize that perspective by reading texts from women written in the first centuries, of our two women early, I would say about 2,000 years ago, right? So first centuries of our era. One from, let's see here, put it in yellow. No, I can go. So one text from a nun called Tisa, and it's supposed to be something that was spoken to her by the Buddha. It says, Tisa, that's Buddha speaking. Train yourself, that's Buddha speaking, but that's her writing it, right? Tisa, train yourself strictly. Don't let what can hold you back overwhelm you. When you are free from everything that holds you back, you can live in the world without the depravities that ooze out from within. Right? Then another text from a nun called Sangha. Abandoning houses, going forth, giving up son, livestock, and all that is dear, leaving behind desire, anger, and ignorance, discarding them all, having pulled out craving down to the roots, I have become cool. I am free. Another one from Sumangala's mother. She is writing to her son. He says, dear one who is quite free, dear one who is quite freed, I too am well freed from the pestle. My shameless husband, even the sunshade he worked under, and my pots that stink like a water snake all disgust me. As I as I destroyed anger and the passion for sex, I was reminded of the sound of bamboo being split. I go to the foot of a tree and think, happiness. And from within that happiness, I begin to meditate, right? Here's a woman writing to her son about her leaving the world. Now, I would like to put this discourse in a parenthesis. Sometime discussing with different people, I hear, yes, there is, renunciation, but within the Mahayana Buddhist project, there is this idea of compassion for others and not just renouncing the world, but actually, sustaining others and giving ourselves to others. And while this is true, there is the ideal of compassion. Renunciation remains pervasive within the Mahayana worldview. And I would like to read here just a few verses from a text called the Bodhicharyavatara, which, if you want, is laying down the foundation of Mahayana ethics, right? So it's the path of a bodhisattva, so of a Mahayana saint. Uh, One verse says, I do hereby give up all my enjoyments and merits of the past, the present, and the future without feeling any sense of loss for the benefit of all beings. So, yes, there is this idea of still be somehow helping others, but nonetheless in a very detached and removed manner. Another verse says, Nirvana is total renunciation. I think this is quite clear and explicit. Nirvana is total renunciation, and my mind seeks nirvana. If I have to renounce all, it is better given away for the good of beings. Right? I think that's quite clear. Now, perhaps one, because it was all kind of in Buddhist context, I could take one from Shankara, a very important philosopher of Advaita in Hindu context. In the Upanishad Sahasri, he says, if one resorts to the medicine of knowledge and detachment, so which means renunciation here, which quenches the burning thirst of earthly experience, one is freed from the succession of reincarnation due to the disorders caused by the fever of desires, karma here, which are accompanied by 1,000 sufferings. All right. So all this to say, I wanted you to hear it somehow, within the literature. So I'm not making this up. The trope of renunciation is pervasive. Yet there has been in contemporary scholarship a kind of downplaying of this idea of renunciation in favor of more social readings or in favor of a strictly epistemological approach. So a very analytical approach to Indian philosophy is interested solely in the arguments of the text without wondering why are these arguments made in the first place. My book tried to bring forward that a lot of the philosophizing happening there is to convince people to leave society. And once they have done that, to leave everything that they identify with. And the texts are radical. Everything means, so they slowly deculture, I don't know how to say, enculturation or deculturation of the individual. This we see happening in literature through a literature we could call apophatic. So quite, there's a formula in the Upanishad which is reoccurring quite often, and it is rehappening in different texts of the Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain. So in the Upanishad, we hear this neti neti, which means not this, not that. And one is presented with different lists, if you want, of ontological realities, even not just elements of the world, but often these texts, when they go about negating the world, what I find fascinating is that they negate their own canon. So there is this quote from the Upanishad which said, Dve vidye veditavye para aparacha. So there are two truth, ultimate and relative. And then the next verse goes about what is this? What is relative? The relative is explained as everything within the world, all the Vedas, the astrology, all the scholastic categories of what the Vedas contain. So all the world known at the time, plus the phenomenal world. And what is actually Paravidya, so absolute knowledge in that sense, is Brahman or the true self, right? And so the commentators, in particularly in Advaita, will insist that one who want to one who wants to know the self has to go through obviously knowing the Veda, but there comes a point where even the Veda must be abandoned because the Veda lies within the world, right? And this is, I find, is pretty unique to the Indian context. It's extremely rare that you see a religious tradition on the world stage that teaches his disciple to be aware that, for example, the Bible or the Quran is not absolute truth, but it's a finger pointing at the moon. So it's also extremely rare that you have tradition that says your guru is a friend, but he is not somebody that you must rely on ultimately. Somebody in those we have, I try to put in the book some quotations, some beautiful one from the Jain, actually. We try to say somebody who relies on scriptures and teacher, he is not independent. He's like somebody who is who needs prompts, somebody who needs a walking stick. As long as there are these walking sticks, one is still not free, right? So there is a very interesting dimension in this renunciation in Gnostic yoga, where one, if we want, first build the world through metaphysics, through the scriptures. One must study, right? So one must, through one culture, get to know the world and visualize how the world appears. That is learned through the teachings, through what philosophy allows you to discover. And once you have seen the world, you must see in that world what you are and what you are not. Right? So here metaphysics serves a dialectic, serves to see by contrast. If we had more time, I will show you how this is presented in the Samkhya Karika. It's interesting. We have a text about 70 verses. The entire text wants to teach some people, teach the students how to know Purusha. In that context, Purusha is the self, consciousness. So out of 70 verses, there's only one verse on Purusha. And it says Purusha is everything that is not Prakriti. And what is Prakriti? And it's a long question, often translated as nature or different things. I think it's a bit more complex, but say perhaps for us here, we could say Prakriti is whatever appears to the mind. I think Schopenhauer would have said Prakriti is a representation, right? So we have a text of 70 verses where everything that the text teaches is what one is not. But how the text function is actually explaining the creation of the world and try to invite the disciple to dissolve the world back. So the world is created in a very metaphysical manner from the most subtle, if you want, principle, in a very kind of Plotinus manner, from buddhi, from the intellect down to the grossest element. And then the disciple is invited to reverse that process and isolate this word kaivalya, isolate the self, right? So we could say here, the text actually, the medicine is built out of poison. So the world, everything that one learns is what one is not. One must take poison in order to build medicine. That to me, that's speaking because first it's a principle in Tantra, but it's also an old principle for the Greek, right? We all know, I think in Germany, there's so many apotheke. So I remember seeing apotheke everywhere. But for the old Greeks, um, the the word pharmakon, which give in French pharmacie, so for it means poison, right? We make medicine out of poison, and that's somehow a bit how it works in this old Indian Gnostic context. The texts usually teach you a lot about the world, but this world is the poison which we are somehow by habit engaging ourselves, infatuating ourselves with. And the practice, if you want the yoga here, the mental asceticism or intellectual asceticism is about discovering, the poisonous nature of that world, right? So by building an antidote, and then slowly, yes, I just saw your message, and then slowly somehow helping one to isolate one's mind from what appears to it. Now, I think I've said a lot. It's been perhaps already 30 minutes. Just perhaps a few questions that can I raise myself, in the end, and I can open this to you, and you tell me, where you want to go with that. So I wrote briefly, so how can such a way of life be meaningful today? Right. And particularly for people interested, perhaps like you and me, in a kind of therapeutic approach to philosophy, we look sometimes for approach that are practical, something that is helpful for people. Particularly what I find is that, if we approach this practice of counseling in a very psychological manner, but what we learn from psychology, particularly psychiatry, the idea is to, help people function, right? So we want to help people function in society. So they can go back, they come, they have some counseling, and they can go back in the world and function within the world somehow. And in these texts, what I'm trying to say, this does not work anymore, right? There is the idea of functioning within a dysfunctional world would be nonsense. So that here they're trying to say, once you realize the world is dysfunctional, it is not, if you have difficulty aligning yourself with that world, it's not because you have a problem, because there is an inherent problem in that world somehow, and you have to distance yourself from this. I'm wondering how can one turn this, what kind of insights it can give us. Some ideas that came to me is that we can speak of different degrees of renunciation, right? There is the Gnostic ideal is extreme. It's really radical and it's very advanced in its practice. So obviously it is not for everyone. It is meant for a particular people. And what I mean by this, I find it interesting to put it that way. So it's not a path for everyone, but perhaps it is especially for those who have difficulties with that path, which is for everyone. And we know there are people like this in our counseling. There are people that we encounter, we call them introverts, people who are perhaps they tend to be, if not antisocial, but a bit asocial, a bit rebel, marginals, and so forth, who don't fit in society somehow. And I'm wondering, it speaks to me perhaps from my own youth, as Krishna mentioned at the beginning, but I've, grew up in Montreal on the ground. I've seen drug addiction and marginality and homelessness at a very young age. And I saw the kind of philosophy that was there at the time. And I'm wondering, perhaps an approach somehow inspired by what I just spoke to you might resonate well, with such people who could perhaps use their situation of marginality in a perhaps more dignified manner. In any case, talk about philosophy of inner life. And perhaps one more thing I didn't say that But the idea of suspending one's judgment, that's quite Greek as well, but suspending one's judgment towards one's own thoughts, towards the world, but particularly in politics, allowing folks not to take sides, either right or left. In today's sharply polarized environment, I think it is quite interesting to consider a stance that asks of one to not judge and to not take side, to remain distant from the world in the sense of, neither right, nor middle, nor left, just apolitical. Anyway, I leave it as that. I think I took a lot of your time. You've been really patient. I hope some of this made sense, and I look forward to hear, how it resonated with you.
Karl, thank you so much for your insightful talk.